So Hedda, you wanted to explore with us a really interesting conversation about on the technology side, which is what would lead people to recognise why they might need a performance management solution. What is it that makes them think they might need technology? I reckon there's probably about 4 different reasons, which are data, a need to stay up to date and engage, secondly, a license to operate, and thirdly, a more global and fluid workforce. Data is, the currency these days. It's all about the fact that people, COOs expect HR to come with data, and how many employees have we got, who's performing, who's underperforming, are we leveraging our return on investment of these new recruits, our graduates, etc., etc. How do you do that unless you have some sort of technological solution? Because a manual system just doesn't work. You can't have that data to hand, particularly not, I think, in challenging circumstances where the COOs are really going to be asking some really challenging and difficult decisions. So that's one area that I think it's all about the data and having ready access to data. Do you agree, Roly?
I do. I think a lot of the challenges is making sure that data is accurate and useful, and that is where a lot of the legwork needs to go in. You need to, if you're going to have a system, you need to make sure that it's giving value and benefit to the end users themselves, the people who are putting in the data, so they're able to draw conclusions from the data themselves. Mm-hmm. So, for example, that could be for an employee to see clearly that they've made progress over the last few years, and that could just be by seeing a number of objectives that have been completed, or perhaps seeing an increasing number or frequency of a certain type of feedback being received. So that kind of thing will help employees see that they're making progress, and as a manager, it's great to be able to point to that and say, look, this is how far you've come. It's quite hard to see that sometimes if you're just doing little and often check-ins. And actually, a system can be a great way of aggregating something that you've achieved over a longer period of time that's actually quite subtle. And so, I think that's essential, provided that the data is going in, and the way to get the data to go in is by making sure that it's of value to the users themselves, not just to HR. And I think where technology has gone wrong in HR, especially around performance management, it's ended up, and through no fault of anyone's really, but it's ended up being of more and more use to HR and less use to the individuals themselves, I think. And sometimes it's very tempting for HR to add on extra fields to capture data, little extra bits and pieces here and there that actually then make it less user-friendly from a employee point of view, more useful for HR, but it becomes just a sort of data repository rather than a service that highlights to end users what they're doing, how they're doing, and what they could do differently. What do you think about that, Hedda?
I think that's really interesting, and one of the things that I find quite fascinating, especially when people first start to talk to me about moving towards technology, is that the feedback they struggle with from the workforce is it's going to be much harder to have an honest conversation if I'm going to put something that might not be too great in a piece of technology, because I don't control how that gets used, I don't control what happens to it, and that might come back to bite me, as it were, in the future. So I think I'm completely in alignment with you that CEOs want HR to come with data, like totally there. And I do recognise, certainly from systems that I've seen elsewhere, Roly, this thing of more and more features that are fundamentally for HR that really you can just feel the managers going, what? So I think we're aligned. But I think the flip side of that is that nobody for 1 minute thinks that anything they put in a system is confidential anymore. Nobody, no matter what you say, nobody will believe that. And therefore there's a challenge, isn't there, between winning the trust of people to use it reasonably and to create it so that it's okay to not be perfect in the system. Because otherwise you end up with a garbage in, garbage out. And so HR goes in and goes, look, everybody's scored 5 stars out of 5 or whatever. And the CEO says, well, that's a bit odd because we're missing all our targets. So how can that be? So I think it's interesting, isn't it? That thing about to get good data, you've got to have trust.